Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today as we discuss the journey to reparations presented by the Charles Wright Museum of African American History. Today, myself, Professor Stacey Deering, along with local historian Jamon Jordan and Afro-urbanist Ms. Lauren Hood, will be discussing the history of reparations and the intriguing history that Detroit has with reparations. So we have decided to conduct an exploration and review of reparations. And we've launched a study group that's focused on the eras, the legislation, the events, the evolution, and the history of this monumental and historical movement. Today, we're going to kick off this great discussion. The quest for reparations has stepped to the forefront of several conversations and laws and rooms over the past 18 months at the local and national level. I'm sure many of you, as well as myself, have found yourself intrigued with the chain of events that have triggered the surge of interest and potency in this movement. So we are well aware of the turbulent year we had in 2020 and how those events have led up to magnifying the lens that's been placed on reparations. So today we're going to take a glance at some of the current events and examine the historic elements that led us here. So without further ado, I'm going to turn to our great historian, as soon as I can get this slide together. Give me 1 second. I didn't want this to stay stuck here the whole time. Okay, so this is like a timeline of events we're going to discuss today to give you guys an idea and a roadmap of what we're talking about in regards. So the first question I have for the dynamic Jamon Jordan is this. So the concept of reparations on paper dates back to 1862 during the Civil War, and I say paper for a reason, and Jamon's going to tell us why I said paper. Can we start out by discussing Special Order number 15, what led us there, some events that happened that we didn't know that was off the grid, and how that was issued to confiscate land from Confederate owners to be divided among newly freed slaves in an effort to establish restoration, equity, economic development opportunities for former slaves, even though it was viewed as a temporary peace treaty that was never meant for longevity.
Yes, thank you, Professor Deering. So it is the Civil War where we get the context for the discussion about the issue of reparations. But I do want to say very quickly that about 100 years before this, there's already a lawsuit. Belinda Royal, this black woman who had been enslaved on the Royal Plantation in Rhode Island, and she's enslaved by Isaac Royal, who is one of the major funders of or major donors to what we know as Harvard University. And he escapes. He leaves the country because of the results of the Revolutionary War. Of course, he's a British loyalist. When the colonists win, he, of course, thinks that he's going to be prosecuted by the newly created government, the colonial government, or the former colonial government. And so he escapes to Canada. He goes to Canada, which is still British territory, and leaves his plantation. So these are people who are enslaved. One of these people on that plantation, Belinda Royal, a black woman, says, not only should I be free, but because I was enslaved and I never got any pay, and now that I'm free, I don't have any funds, I ought to be compensated for being enslaved and not having funds, and no one is here to take care of me now. And she wins this lawsuit. So there is a reparations lawsuit win in 1783, right after the Revolutionary War, by a black woman. So I want to start there. But now, when we get to the 1860s, we're in the middle of the Civil War. And everybody should know that the Civil War is about slavery. So despite what everybody might be saying, back then or right now, the Civil War is about slavery. The South secedes over the issue of slavery. Lincoln's fighting a war to bring them back to the United States, but there would be no war had they not seceded, and they would not have seceded if the issue of slavery wasn't on the table. And so that's what the issue is about. So abolitionists have been fighting and lobbying the federal government to end slavery. Lincoln's been holding that up, and he won't sign the Emancipation Proclamation until almost 2 years into the war, on January 1st, 1863. But in the middle of the war, there's stuff happening on the ground that Lincoln can't 100% control. So there are military fights. There is invasions of the South. the Union generals are making decisions on the ground that they have to deal with. And one of those decisions is what we're going to do with these black people that as we invade the South, black people are running to our camps because they're not dumb. They know, hey, you fighting my slave owner. So that means they're my enemy too, and they're your enemy. So if we both got the same enemy, we must be friends. So black people are escaping to Union camps, Union military posts. In some cases, they're being designated as contraband. And so they are working for the Union military. They're carrying the packs of the Union generals. They're cleaning, they're cooking. But in some cases, the Union military is overwhelmed with them and trying to find what can we do with these? What can we do with them? We got to continue fighting this war, and we can't fight this war and maintain these black people who are escaping from slavery. And so what happens in 1861 and 1862 is a set of experiments known as Mitchellville, the Port Royal experiment. They're taking land from slave owners who have escaped and run away from Union military. The Union has invaded, taken over these areas in South Carolina, in Florida, in Georgia, on the southeastern seaboard. The Union government has taken control of these areas. And they got all this land. And these black people are escaping to them. They're now turning this land over to black people. So black people are farming on this land from 1861 to before the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. These black people are free. They're taking over this land. They're farming it. They're setting up their own schools. So schools are being set up for the first time. Mandatory education for black people is being set up in this area of the South during the Civil War. And so they have schools, they have businesses, they're paying taxes. So the government says, hey, they doing pretty good. Let's tax them. So they paying taxes. They have a fully functioning society that is run by black people who are in control of the land. And then when we get to Savannah, Georgia in 1865, William Tecumseh Sherman, who is also facing this same problem. He's been facing it for the last 4 years of the war. He is facing the same problem. Black people escaping from slavery, escaping from these plantations, and overwhelming the military posts. And General Sherman is not an abolitionist. And so many of the military generals who are instituting these rules and giving land to black people, they're not abolitionists. They don't believe, all of them don't, some of them do, but all of them don't believe in freedom for black people, and they definitely don't believe in equality for black people. But because of this war, and they want to win this war, they're coming up with practical solutions of dealing with this African-American population who are overwhelming the military camps. And this is also what is going to overwhelm Abraham Lincoln himself and force him to end up signing the Emancipation Proclamation. So now you have this section of near Georgia, South Carolina, Florida. This area has been fully taken over by the Union military. And there's thousands, over 40,000 black people who are now, their slave owners are gone. They don't have a form of income. They don't have a way of taking care of themselves unless they have access to land. And William Tecumseh Sherman meets with black leaders. So he doesn't come up with this on his own. His other military lieutenants meet with a group of black leaders and ask them, what can we do to deal with this black population? What can we do to appease this black population so that they can stop running to the military camps and overwhelming us while we're fighting this war? And these black leaders say up front, land, give them land. And Sherman has a precedent in Mitchellville, in the Port Royal experiment in the South Carolina Sea Islands, where land had been given and black people had taken over that land. They're being educated and they're paying taxes. So when they say this is not a far out kind of thing for the first time Sherman's ever heard this. This is already being practiced in a part not far from where they are in Savannah, Georgia. So Sherman issues field order number 15, special field orders number 15, which will apportion 40 acres to these thousands of black people in the eastern seaboard, southeastern seaboard of the United States, to get 40 acres, not more than 40 acres, that they will be able to own, take care of, and it will be a way of them sustaining themselves. So they will be self-sufficient on their own land. That's January 1865. We're not sure if that would have been the policy after the war. This is the war policy. So we're not sure if it would have carried over after the war. We're not sure if Lincoln would have accepted this after the war was over. He may have, we don't know. Lincoln was always kind of evolving on the issue of slavery and equality. He hadn't yet gotten to full equality, believing in full equality in January of 1865. But he's assassinated in April of 1865. So we won't get to find out what after the war Lincoln would have done, because his vice president is Andrew Johnson. And Andrew Johnson is a Southern sympathizer, except he disagrees with their secession, but he is not a believer in black equality. He is not a believer in punishing the South after the Civil War is over. And so he's going to revoke this military field order from William Sherman once he becomes president. And so that land will be confiscated from the people who had been enslaved and redistributed to the former white slave owners in the South. And so that was one case where African Americans, black people, had gotten land in some cases, but it had been taken back after the Civil War was over.
So when we got to the Reconstruction Era, right, which is well, it kind of starts during the Civil War, but it's like post-Civil War, right? This is the time where we're supposed to see former slaves migrated and blended into society with rights, access. They're supposed to have access to the economic plan, right? But we see that Special Order Number 15 was taken out.
That's right.
So now we're here 150, 200 years, et cetera, later, having the same discussion about reparations and what happened during that time. So during that time, though, we've seen a lot of activists kind of raise up. So can we talk about Miss Callie House and how influential she was in bringing back up the reparations movement, because we saw how it was suppressed and oppressed and wiped out? Can we talk about her?
That's right, yes. Callie House, again, a black woman. Whenever we're talking about the movement for racial progress, racial equality, black liberation, black women are always at the forefront of that struggle. So you see it, again, all the way back in 1783 with Belinda Royal, and then you see it in 1896 with Callie House, who founds this organization and they don't call it reparations, but it is ex-slave pensions. And so this is a national organization that will organize on promoting, fighting for people who had been enslaved to get a pension for slavery. But that's what they're using, the word pensions, but the ex-slave pensions is reparations. Right. It's what we're calling reparations today. It's people who were enslaved who didn't get paid, and now that they're no longer enslaved, they ought to be paid a pension. And that's what we think of as pensions. You used to work, you retired after your work, and you get a pension because of all that work you put in back when you were working. And because of that, an investment, a portion of all that work you put in is held for you so that when you are done working, when you retire, you get some money to be able to take care of yourself after your work is done. Well, that's what this is. So people who have been enslaved and hadn't been paid, now that they're no longer enslaved, they're no longer doing that work, they're free now, they ought to be able to get a pension. And she fights for that. And this movement is important. It's the first national movement for reparations. That's the first thing we need to understand, that Belinda Royal was a single lawsuit. She was suing for herself. And then in the Civil War, that's to deal with this group of black people in the southeastern seaboard who were enslaved but are now free because of the Civil War. So it was just dealing with that group of people. It wasn't for the whole country. But now we have a fight for national reparations, a pension for all black people who are ex-slaves. And Callie House, and she has a partner, Isaiah Dickerson, they fight to lead this fight. But of course, the state governments and the federal government try to shut this down. And Callie House, of course, will be imprisoned in 1918. But this black woman had led this fight for reparations and put it back on the table because it had been missing from the discussion, from the national discussion at least, since the Civil War. So since 1865, since Andrew Johnson became the president and revoked Special Field Orders number 15, that there was no national discussion about reviving this fight for reparations. There were, here and there, people who brought it back up, but she brought it to a national level again in 1896, starting this organization, and then was imprisoned, which helped to shut down this discussion about reparations again. But Callie House is an unsung hero that we ought to be talking about when we talk about the issue of fighting for reparations.
Oh, I agree. So the irony here, or the iconic moment, depending on how you look at it, is when we look at the time frame, right? So Reconstruction era is from like 1863 to 1877, and then we venture into the 1900s. Women couldn't even vote.
That's right.
Women couldn't even really work.
That's right.
Right, and even though black men technically had the right to vote because we had the civil rights movement, they still couldn't vote, right?
That's
Because
right.
so many oppressive tactics. But even through the adversity, we had black women kind of raising up to the front for liberation movements and to be activists.
That's right.
So once we hit 1918, which ironically is right before the right to vote for women is passed 2
That's
years
right.
later, right? We're entering World War I, and then we're entering World War II. And that also had an impact on African Americans. So can we talk about how reparations had to kind of come through again, back to the forefront in that discussion when we had blacks coming home from the war and trying to reintegrate back into society? Can we touch on that?
Yeah, so what's going on right at this point in history after Reconstruction ends? So Reconstruction ends in 1876, the election of Rutherford B. Hayes. And then by the time we get to the 1890s, and of course in 1896 is Plessy versus Ferguson.
Right.
And so now the federal government has come forth and accepted and basically is supportive of Jim Crow, of racial inequality after the Supreme Court decision, Plessy versus Ferguson. And really in this time period, we call this the nadir, or the nadir of race relations. You have lynchings at a high level. You have almost every state and city has some form of segregation. And it's intense in some places. It could get you killed. In other places, you could be just embarrassed going into a place and not being served. But there's this level of racial inequality throughout the country. Jim Crow is a national phenomenon, not just a Southern phenomenon. Right. So you have that going on. And then you also have the Great Migration. So that's going on too. You have black people leaving the South to get away from the most severe versions of Jim Crow. It's not like they're leaving Mississippi Jim Crow and coming to Michigan equality. They're leaving Mississippi Jim Crow lynchings every day somewhere in a southern state and coming to Michigan where there's housing discrimination, where the schools are unequal, where there's police brutality, but there's not a lynching every day. And black people can register to vote. And black people can get a job that pays a living wage. They're not forced into sharecropping, and they're not forced into tenant farming. So there's some differences in the way it looks in the North versus the South. Economically, it looks different, and politically it looks different because black people can vote, they can register to vote, and it's the violence level is different because there's not a lynching. Lynching does happen in the North, but nowhere near on the level that it's happening in the South. So that's happening, but there's going to be a backlash. As more black people come to these northern areas, there is a feeling, a mood of the whites who live in Indiana, who live in Ohio, who live in Boston, who live in Philadelphia, who live in Michigan, including Detroit, about these black people are coming here and they're invading our neighborhoods, they're taking our jobs. So now you're going to have some issues that happen as a backlash to the Great Migration, and then World War I. And now you have black people who are fighting in World War I and believing that this is a means to being acceptable, being citizens and being treated as citizens. And this also is going to cause a major backlash. In 1919, we get Red Summer. So we get race riots throughout the country as a response to the Great Migration. That's partly a response to that. More black people coming into cities that were overwhelmingly white in the North and in the West. And black people coming back from the war and believing that they ought to be treated equally. They're demanding their rights after coming back from World War I. They're wearing their uniforms, and that's one of the most likely events of a person being beaten and attacked, is a black man wearing his World War I military uniform. So you have all of that happening at this time, and Callie House is in prison. So at the same time all of this is happening, Callie House is put in prison during the same time. And it's no coincidence that this is a backlash to the racial progress of black people leaving the South and coming to the North, finding an economic progress, even though It's not social equality. It's not full racial equality, but there's an economic progress for African Americans in working in northern industries versus being sharecroppers and tenant farmers in the South. So they're moving up economically. They're having access to resources. They're able to run for office. They're able to vote for office. They're able to register to vote in these places. So all of that, there's a backlash to all of that. And Callie House is going to feel the brunt of part of that backlash by being placed in prison at the same time that all of this other stuff is happening.
Wow. So like this great history lesson, right? I'm so excited. But because we're talking about this era, can we talk about how Detroit makes its presence known and enters the reparation movement, the unspoken history, that hidden gem? Can we touch on that?
So Detroit is segregated at this time. So there's never been a time where all black people lived in one neighborhood in the city of Detroit. So sometimes it's said that way, but that's not true. But there is a time when the black population is highly concentrated in one or two neighborhoods in the city of Detroit. And they're in the Lower East Side. So the highest concentration of black people in the city of Detroit after the first leg of the Great Migration from 1910 to 1930, that's that first leg of the Great Migration, the highest concentration of African Americans in the Lower East Side in a neighborhood that is historically known as Black Bottom. And out of it is a business and entertainment district that grows called Paradise Valley. These two neighborhoods are the center of African Americans, but it's overcrowded. And it's becoming a slum because of its overcrowded conditions. An area that's meant to really comfortably house about 30,000 people has 140,000 people living in it by the end of the Great Migration. So you got way more people living in this area than ought to be because of housing discrimination. And so black people are trying to buck up against housing discrimination. And so in this same time period that you have the 1919 race riots, which is Red Summer, 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, 1923 Rosewood, 1919 Elaine, Arkansas Massacre. This same time period in 1925, you have the Ocean Sweep incident. A black man buying a home outside of Black Bottom and a mob showing up to deal with him for trying to buy that home or trying to live in that home outside of Black Bottom. So Detroit is segregated. So one of the forms of resistance to segregation is black people to create their own institutions. And so you got Paradise Valley and black businesses being created. But another form is for black people to say, no, we're not the ones that's inferior. It's white people who are the devils. And the Nation of Islam will be founded in 1930 in the city of Detroit. Their temple is on Hastings Street, 3408 Hastings Street, which is roughly across Hastings. So if you know where Hastings was, the 375 and I-75 freeway is there now. If you're going down the Chrysler, that's also the other name for it, the Chrysler Freeway. If you're going down the Chrysler, you'll come from the river or from Jefferson. You get on at Jefferson, and you drive, and you're going to pass the Brewsters. So you're going to get to about Mack. So right in that area, right across Hastings from the Brewster Wheeler Center, where Joe Louis is learning how to box, is a little storefront, a group of storefronts. One of them is the Castle Theater. You enter the Castle Theater at 3412 Hastings, and you go up the side stairs on the right, and there's an upstairs, like a meeting room. That's 3408 Hastings Street. That's the Temple of Islam. That's where the Nation of Islam has their first meetings. That is their first temple. They're at Hastings Street. They're going to open up a school there. And they're going to come up with what we believe and what we want. And in there, what we believe and what we want is a demand for reparations, a demand for land that will belong to black people. They will create their own nations, and their own nation. And the federal government will fund this because of the history of slavery. So this is payment for your enslavement of us. For all of these years, we're going to be paid, but we're going to be paid in land. And so the Nation of Islam, founded in the city of Detroit in 1930, that's why we call any temple that's found, any temple of the Nation of Islam in Detroit is always called Temple Number 1. Because Detroit is number 1. Detroit is where the Nation of Islam is founded. So they move from place to place. They move from Hastings to other places. They moved on Linwood. They moved from Linwood. They on Wyoming near Finkel. Wherever they move, wherever they are, we still call it Temple Number 1. Detroit is the founding, is where the Nation of Islam was founded. and they demand reparations. And now we're in 1930s. So a decade after Callie House was forced to end her fight by being placed in prison, you have a revival of it right here in the city of Detroit.
So that's so rich because as we keep journeying on, we enter the civil rights movement era, right?
That's right.
And we know there's some roots here. We know even Dr. King even came here. So we enter the civil rights movement. We get, I call them micro progressions, right? A series of laws passed to try to gain equity. So we get there. Now, once we cross that threshold within Detroit, we get to the founding of HR 40.
That's right.
Right, that we're talking about today, that just had like a historical moment on April 14th.
That's right.
So we get to this Congressional Reparations Study Bill that was actually introduced by our own late great John Conyers.
That's right.
Right, and Reparations Ray Jenkins brings it to him and says, hey, I need you to push this forward because we need to bring the discussion back. We made it through the civil rights movement. We still haven't gained equity.
That's right.
So we're still fighting for that. We're going to transform it a little bit. And now
going throughout the country, and he's going to be the minister at Temple Number 7 in Harlem. He's interacting with people who are not Muslim. So there are people who are friends of Malcolm, people who listen to Malcolm, people who consider Malcolm their teacher and leader, even though they never joined the Nation of Islam. And so Malcolm is having a profound effect throughout the country, but no more than he having in the city of Detroit. And so there's three sets of people who are really listening to Malcolm. One of them is Reverend Albert Clegg Jr., who is the pastor at Central United Church of Christ, which will become the Shrine of the Black Madonna. Okay. And he starts what is known as the Black Christian Nationalist Movement. And so now he's demanding reparations. And so now you already had it in Islam, in the Nation of Islam, but now you got a Christian church saying we ought to have reparations. And then you have James and Grace Lee Boggs, who are friends of Malcolm and friends of Reverend Clegg, and now they're getting involved. And so you have them bringing even a worker's idea, a almost socialist idea into the talk about reparations, but really in the talk of black nationalism and black power. And then very important is Richard and Milton Henry. Richard and Milton Henry are attorneys and friends of Malcolm. They will take his idea, although they're not members of the Nation of Islam. Actually, they were members of the Shrine of the Black Madonna. They were members of that church. But they will take his idea and organize a group of like-minded black nationalists to make land the basis of their fight for liberation. And so land will be the basis of liberation for the Republic of New Africa. The chief two founders are from the city of Detroit. It's founded in the city of Detroit in 1968, and they make land the basis, and they call themselves the Republic of New Africa, and they're basically saying we're going to take some land from some of the southern states where the black population is the largest. That will be this new nation called the Republic of New Africa, and they will push the reparations battle to the next level because they are highly behind in another person, another black woman I can't leave out, is Queen Mother Moore. So Queen Mother Moore, another black nationalist who had also been talking to Malcolm, even though she never joined the Nation of Islam, she goes all the way back to the Garvey movement. And the socialists. So she's been involved in the black socialist movement. She's been involved with the Garveyites. And now she's also been talking. She's talking on both ends to the nationalists who are kind of considered the outsiders. So people like Malcolm, people like Milton and Richard Henry, people like Reverend Albert Clegg, they kind of like considered the outsiders and the insiders, people in politics. So she's at the National Black Political Convention in 1972 telling them that reparations got to be part of any national black political agenda. Reparations, you got to get your reparations. And so she's putting that on the table. And then in 1987, really spurred more by the Republic of New Africa than anybody else, but other people like Reparations Ray Jenkins, that group, the NCOBRA, National Coalition on Black Reparations in America, NCOBRA is founded, and at its crux are people who are parts of the Republic of New Africa and the New African Independence Movement in general, and people who would consider so they would be considered the outsiders, black nationalists, but then other people who consider the more respectable and politicians and people who are political consultants, they're part of it too. And Reparations Ray Jenkins is talking to John Conyers and telling him, you got to make this a part of your political agenda. You can't just have us out here as nationalists and as radicals, and it just sounds so crazy. This needs to be part of the regular political discussion when when we're talking about fighting against racism, reparations has to be on the table. And so the organization's founded in 1987. 2 years later, John Conyers places H.R. 40, attempts to have it put it on the House floor. He states it on the House floor, but it never makes it to committee or through committee. So it never it never got voted on by the full House while John Conyers was in Congress. So he had fought for it for decades, but while he was a Congress member, it never got voted on by the full House. But that will make reparations a part of the national conversation, not just from the black nationalists, which is really some of a major part of the root of where it came from, but now you can find a black attorney, you can find a black doctor, you can find some of the most respectable, and I'm putting that in quotes, by this society's definition of respectable, you'll find many of the most respectable people in society, not just the firebrands, but respectable people in society who will tell you that black people ought to have reparations. African Americans need reparations. And politicians on every level have been placing this. So you have, of course, on the federal level, H.R. 40, but then you have state legislators and state reps who have attempted to put it on ballots in their states. You have city councils and mayors who've done it on the city level. You've had business people in cities who have put forward a demand for reparations in some sort. You've had universities be a part of this discussion now. Universities who have benefited from donations by slave owners, or even founding by slave owners, or even slave labor or slave sales. The sales of people who were enslaved has helped universities. Of course, Georgetown being the most notable example of this. When Georgetown is about to close in the early 1800s, because there's just not enough Catholics who are immigrating to the country who are wealthy enough to have the money to send their kids to this upscale private school, Georgetown, they're about to shut down. And what saves them? Yeah, well, the board of trustees, the priests are all slave owners. And they sell 300 people that they own into New Orleans. New Orleans is the largest slave market in America's history. More people were bought and sold in New Orleans than any other place in the United States history. So they're sold into New Orleans. And the funds, the profit from the sale of these 300 black people keeps Georgetown afloat. That's why you can go to Georgetown today, because 300 black people got sold in the early 1800s to keep it afloat. So that's why we still have a Georgetown. That's why people can say, go Hoyas. But they have created a reparations program. And their reparations program is that the descendants of the 300 people that they enslaved, if they get in, so they still have to apply, they still have to get good enough grades and good enough test scores to get in, but if they apply and get in, then they go to college for free. And so they're able to go to, and so there's already been a number of descendants who have taken advantage of this reparations program. And there are other universities who have coming up with similar programs, some in Europe even, who were involved in the slave trade, like Cambridge and University of Scotland. So there's other universities who are doing it in Europe, but Harvard, Brown, Dartmouth, Rutgers, Yale, Princeton, Columbia, all of them were all involved in in slavery, or benefited from the donations of major slave owners. And so they're all dealing with this issue of reparations as well.
So I'm so glad that you mentioned how reparations can look in the 21st century, and also how reparations has never been a new phenomenon, because even other countries, ethnicities have seen reparations, benefited from it, and experienced it. So now that we're here in the 21st century today, and we're seeing what's happening at the local level and how that's impacting the national level, can we talk about which method you think is the most effective way for H.R. 40 to proceed now that we're here? We've passed April 14th. We passed June 15th with Detroit, right? What happened with the task force that's been assembled. So now that we're looking out at where we're at today, what do you think is the most effective approach to get more traction or to have a successful outcome?
So I have to admit that as a historian, I'm much more comfortable talking about what has already happened than what might happen or what could happen in the future or even present. I'm much more comfortable talking about history than I am talking about the present. But just looking at history and what has happened before, what I believe is first, you target the institutions who were directly involved or directly benefited from slavery. So that's part of it. That can't be the only answer, but that is part of it. And so universities, businesses, railroads, banks, insurance companies, these are institutions that still exist today that were involved in slavery or benefited directly from slavery. They ought to be a part of any kind of reparations program. They benefited from forced labor of human beings or the sales of humans as if they were property. And so they ought to be the first in line to have to do some kind of restitution and reparations. And of course, a part of all of this is governments. So city governments benefited from slavery. In Rhode Island and in Massachusetts, they tax the slave owners. So slave owners who bring people in, so that means the slave ships and the slave traders, they're taxed, and the people who actually buy the people are taxed. This funds the municipal developments in Rhode Island, in Boston, much of their early municipal developments, their streets being paved, their schools being opened, their roads being created, was paid for by the taxes from these slave sales. And so governments, and so of course the federal government, but before we even get there, city governments benefited, state governments benefited, and then of course the federal government itself. So these are the people that must be a part of it because they directly benefited. Now indirectly, there's a whole bunch of other people who benefited, and so many of the ordinances that have been written and many of the proposals that have been written are to address these other groups of people who didn't directly benefit. They may not have even existed 200 years ago, but they indirectly benefited. So they eventually have to be addressed as well. So I would fashion some type of reparations program based on the historical fight for reparations on these levels, starting with the people who will have to deal with it the harshest. The highest level of compensation will go to the people who directly benefited and directly were involved in the enslavement and the institution of slavery. So they directly benefited from it or they were involved directly in it. And we have institutions that still exist right now that were involved in it. We have banks that are still around. So New York Life insured enslaved people for slave owners. So slave owners can make money from them while they were living. So in people who are enslaved, they're making a profit for slave owners while they're living because they're picking the cotton, they're picking the tobacco, they're growing the tobacco, the sugar, the rice, the indigo. They're also doing all the other things that are necessary to be done on a plantation. So they're the tailors, they're the brick masons, they're the cooks. They're all the skilled trades that are necessary to be done on the plantation. They're doing all of that. So the slave owner doesn't have to pay someone to do those things. So all of that they're benefiting from it. And then when that person dies, when people die on the plantation, the slave owner files a claim with the life insurance company that they've got this, hey, I want to get a little bit of money on, even though this person I enslaved is dead, I want to get a little bit more money from them. And so yes, insurance companies are highly involved. And so yes, you go after those groups. They pay the highest. The Tulsa Race Reparations Commission really laid a good format out. And you can just flip it for other places. The people who receive the most in reparations are the survivors of the Tulsa Race Massacre and their descendants. That's first. Then the business and community in Greenwood itself will get the next level. And then African Americans in Tulsa, the next level. And then something that will educate and inform everybody. Whites and black folks need to be able to go to a museum and learn this history of what happened in Tulsa, because even that was done, that the history was kept from the people. So they weren't able to ever know what happened in Tulsa. This is kind of something that could be built upon and tweaked for whatever area you're in, because Mississippi's reparations should look different than Michigan's reparations. Okay. Now, there needs to be some national reparations that might look very similar everywhere, but state by state will look different. What Michigan ought to do and what Detroit ought to do for people who were affected or the descendants of or the institutions that were involved in slavery will look different than what Texas or Mississippi or Alabama would do, because, of course, the level of participation and the level of relationship in the institution of slavery is going to be different for a place like Alabama or New Orleans than it is for a place like Detroit or Chicago.
Makes sense, makes sense. So this has been like an amazing history lesson with a lot of uncovered gems that we need to know in the community, especially as we are on this crusade for reparations today. So I think it's interesting to get a higher level perspective through our Afro-urbanist, Ms. Lauren Hood, who's going to ask you more about the reparations movement and things that are happening and how that pertains to our discussion today. So I'm going to turn it over to my lovely co-host, Ms. Lauren Hood.
Thank you, Stacey. So Jamon, it's interesting when you said a minute ago, you're like, I know you're a historian. Everybody knows you're a historian. But you're also an activist. Okay. You're like, I don't like talking about the present. Like, there's a reason that you teach people history, right?
Right, that is true.
You want us to do something.
That is true.
So what do you want us to do? Why are you evangelizing all over the world about Black history? Because you want us to do something.
That's right, that's right. So I want to activate this history. I believe that this history, when you know it, it activates something you ought to be doing about it. So I'm not a person that teaches history for history's sake, you know, although I probably would if we didn't have all this horrible history that has happened that we ought to rectify. So even if I love history, so I would do it probably if that weren't the case. But it is the case. So we ought to be doing something. This history ought to motivate us to do something, you know. And so when you go to the doctor, the first thing they ask is, before you can even go back and see the doctor, they make you fill out this medical history form. Because before they can work on you, they need to know what other stuff you've gone through. What other problems have you had? Have you ever had asthma? You know, do you have sickle cell? You know, whatever. They have to know this medical history. What drugs have you taken? You know, and are you allergic to this? You know, so they need to know all that stuff before they can work on you, because what they might do something that makes it worse if they don't know this history. So that's kind of how I see history. I see history as you got to do that before you can come up with the cure. You got to start here with what has happened, because if you don't know that part, then what you do to try to solve the problem, the cure might be worse than the disease itself if you don't know this history. So that's what I believe. So yes, I feel like this history ought to be activated when we see what has happened, when we see what has happened in slavery, when we see what has happened in redlining and housing discrimination, when we see what has happened in school inequality, when we see what has happened in race massacres like Tulsa and like the Red Summer of 1919, when we see these events, all of this comes back together to say that there ought to be some form of restitution for a group of people who have gone through this, and there has to be some kind of compensation paid out in some form by the people who benefited from or were involved in this. So, yeah, I do believe that part of the fight for reparations is this history part. So you start with this history part, and then you move to activating this history by doing something and making demands on what has happened. One of the things that I learned from the fight against anti-Semitism, I've done tours with the Jewish Historical Society of Michigan, and one thing they say is never again. And they mean it. I mean, it's not like a little slogan that they say. They have political organizing and lobbying and all that, all about making sure that anti-Semitism is considered a calumny, something horrible in America, in world history, and it ought to be stamped out the minute it rears its head. That is kind of what I think our history, it ought to activate some things to happen. It ought to be an agenda that is undergirded, not totally driven by, but undergirded with this history. This history ought to inform an agenda that ought to be happening. And so, yeah, that's kind of what I believe. So, yeah, I got to talk about present day things, but through the lens of history.
And you want us to activate, and I bring that up because in a lot of my roles as a community developer, I'm privy to a lot of conversations, and not everybody is on board with reparations. And I don't mean organizations, government institutions, or white people. I mean black people.
That's right.
There are black people who are not ready to receive these reparations. So for those folks who might not know that earlier history that you talked about, but who were certainly here for urban renewal or had parents who experienced the negative impacts of urban renewal, for those folks who still aren't ready to buy into reparations for us, what do you think is the most important thing for them to learn or understand?
Yeah, so the first thing for them to understand is that reparations, the whole idea, comes from a varied group of sources. So if your only orientation to reparations are the fringe, the black nationalists, now they're fine with me, but for some people, they're a problem. So for some people, the black nationalists, that whole idea of reparations is a problem. But reparations doesn't come from all of those sources. So for them, maybe it's more appropriate for them to understand that William Tecumseh Sherman, a Union general, he's not a black nationalist. He's not on the fringe. He's a Union, he's a white man first, but he's a Union military general. And he talks to some black leaders, most of whom are ministers. They're pastors, most of them. There's a couple of teachers in there, and a couple of other businessmen, but they're mostly ministers. And these ministers talk to him, and he comes up with, well, he don't come up with himself, but they come up with 40 acres for these formerly enslaved people. This makes sense. These are people who had been enslaved. And if they don't get to keep that, which they didn't, then what is the effects of that for them, their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren? So this whole idea of this country, first, they have to not buy into a myth. And sometimes that's hard to get people to move away from a myth. And the myth is that where we are, where everybody is based on their own individual efforts. So the idea of individualism is highly attached to Americanism. The whole idea of America is that you did it. You pulled yourself up. You did it on your own. And it's a big myth. So no one in this country is where they are because of just themselves. They're standing on the shoulders of those who came before them. And so where you are today is because of what people had did before you. And so once we understand that, and we don't even have to go back to slavery. So maybe slavery is the problem. And there's a lot of people who have a whole kind of funny feeling about slavery. They feel ashamed. The descendants of enslaved people feel more ashamed about slavery than the people who are the descendants of the people who are the enslavers. And so that is a real phenomenon. So we don't have to go that far. We can go to the 1930s. In 1934, Franklin Delano Roosevelt starts his New Deal plans. And he starts the first National Housing Act. That's the first federal housing act in this country. The federal government is going to pay construction workers to start building houses again because it's the Great Depression and construction workers are out of business because how are you going to build houses in the Great Depression and nobody's buying those houses? So the federal government is going to put them back to work and say, we're going to pay you to go build those houses because we know nobody else is going to pay you. It's the Great Depression. So they're building houses. People who own houses are in foreclosure. So because it's the Great Depression, so they're in foreclosure. People who want to buy a house can't get a house because it's the Great Depression. So unless you're just rich and you could just buy a house outright, if you can do that, well, that's fine. But if you got to go to the bank and say, I need a loan, it's the Great Depression. Banks ain't giving you no loan. They don't trust you. So because of that, the federal government is going to create the FHA, which is going to back home loans, subsidize them at low interest rates. But they're going to keep black people from being able to be a part of this. The neighborhoods where these homes are subsidized have to be in racially homogeneous neighborhoods, which means one race. Whites move out of black neighborhoods like Black Bottom to take advantage of these home loans. Black people see what's going on and try to get them a home too. And the FHA says, we can't give you back your loan, your home loan, because we only back homes in racially homogeneous neighborhoods. If you move into that neighborhood, that your coworker Frank from the Ford Motor Company moved to, it'll be integrated. And so we don't give home loans in integrated neighborhoods. But black people are like, okay, I hear what you're saying. Well, you know what? Because you've been giving all these home loans, guess what? Black Bottom is all black now. So Black Bottom is a racially homogeneous neighborhood. So give me a home loan in Black Bottom. I already live there. I'll just stay there then. But I won't be paying rent no more like I've been doing. I'll own something. And the federal government says, well, we got these maps here, and they're color-coded of where we give loans out. If you pick a place in the green area, you can get the loan. Okay, I want a place in the green area. Sorry, that will make it integrated, and we don't give home loans in integrated neighborhoods. Okay, blue areas, you'll probably get the loan. Okay, give me one of them blue areas. Nope, sorry, can't do the integration thing. Yellow, probably not gonna get the loan. And red, you cannot get the loan. Black Bottom is red. It's where the term redlining comes from. So black people can't get home loans in the areas where they are, and they can't move to the areas where the home loans are being given out. The federal government is doing this. The federal government is the #1 discriminator in housing in this country's history. So as bad as racial restrictive covenants were written in the deed, as bad as the insurance companies refusing to give you insurance on your homes, the bad as the banks not wanting to give you a home loan, all of that's bad, but the federal government discriminated against more people in housing than any other institution. And so now 20 years later, you can talk to somebody in Detroit right now. Tell me where your grandfather came from. Mississippi, Georgia, Alabama. When they came up here, they worked hard, didn't they? Yep, they worked at Ford. They worked at Packard. They worked at the Fisher Body. They worked at the Dodge Main. So they worked these hard jobs, making pretty good money. But guess what they couldn't do in many cases? They couldn't buy a house. Or if they had to buy a house, they had to buy it with the highest interest rates. Or they had to do it on a, what do they call them when the owner owns the house, but you had to do it on the land contract, where you just really being robbed, really.
It's funny you talk about it like it's history, but this is today.
This is today, right. And so this is what black people were doing and still are doing. So this is what they doing. So I'm paying rent, and this white guy who works at Ford with me, getting paid about the same money, we make about the same money, he got a home. 20 years later, that home he got with an FHA-backed loan he bought it for $5,000, is now worth $40,000, $50,000, $60,000. He can use the equity and send his kids to college, or open up a little store, a little restaurant, a little shop. He can use the money and buy another house and rent this one out, use this as income and live somewhere else. He can do that. What do black people have? Making the same money at Ford or Dodge or Fisher Body or Packard. What do they got 20 years later? They got rent receipts from the Brewsters, which was created by the same federal housing act. The National Housing Act of 1934, which is giving home loans to white people, is building projects for black people. And so black people are living in projects, paying rent, getting no equity, and whites are getting home loans, moving up in wealth. And so today, where we live and what our situation is based on not all from over 100 years ago slavery. A lot of it is based on the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s when the federal government was doing this housing act, which was unequal. And so we're living with the legacy of that right now.
And continuing on that thread of what we're living, what legacies still live, you have blown my mind before when you have dropped bombs about current institutions, corporations, mm-hmm. organizations, mm-hmm. and what they might have to pay for. Mm-hmm. So can you tell us, and let's be Detroit specific this time, right. What institutions in Detroit, in the name of reparations, need to pay up?
Yeah, all right. Well, the longest still existing business in the city of Detroit, and it really is the longest still existing business in the state of Michigan, was founded in 1831. It was founded by Joseph Campau and John Williams. Joseph Campau came from a French family. We know Detroit, so one of the oldest French families, one of the wealthiest French families. They were slave owners. So Joseph Campau, in his life, probably in Detroit, his Detroit part of his life, owned at least 10 people. Probably more, but at least we can document at least 10 people he owned. His sister is Cecile Campbell. She marries a British man whose last name is Williams. They have a child, John Williams. But there's a lot of John Williams. That's pretty much a common name. Even to this day, that's a common name. So he adds a middle initial, John R. Williams. So John R. is a Campbell, but he's John R. Williams, but he's really a Campbell. And he's a slave owner. So John R. and Joseph Campbell are slave owners, and they found the oldest still existing business in the state of Michigan. It was founded as the Michigan Intelligencer and Democratic Free Press. We know it today simply as the Detroit Free Press. So the Detroit Free Press, the newspaper, was founded by two slave owners, and it is a pro-slavery newspaper for the first 30 years of its existence. So it's supporting slavery. It is, I mean, what else would it do? It was founded by a slave owner. So, I mean, why wouldn't it, what else would it do? During the Civil War, when Lincoln, of course, is the president of the United States, Michigan is a union state. Detroit is in Michigan. The Free Press is operating in the city of Detroit, but it's a Southern sympathizing newspaper. It's on the side of the South. So it's anti-Lincoln. It's definitely anti-Emancipation Proclamation. It will foment the 1863 race riot in the city of Detroit, where black people will be attacked, their businesses will be destroyed, 30 buildings will be burned down, homes of black people, businesses of black people. White businesses that had black employees are burned down. White homes who are too close to black homes are burned down. And a black man goes to prison for 7 years for something he didn't commit, which is molesting two girls, which the Free Press helped to fire that idea that he did this. Of course, years later, the girls will recant and say nothing ever happened to them. They were paid to tell that story. So the Free Press is behind that more than anything else. So they're supporters of slavery. So right there, people run slave ads in the Free Press, you know, runaway slave ads. They run those in the Free Press. The Free Press itself supports slavery. It's owned by two slave owners. And it foments a destruction of the black community in 1863 in the middle of the Civil War. It does that. So, yeah, the Free Press owes. Free Press owes, for sure. So that would be one of the institutions that in the city of Detroit that owes. We went, so Taya Miles, a few years ago, wrote a book about slavery in the city of Detroit. Everybody should get that book. They're written by Taya Miles. It is, for some reason I'm drawing a blank of the name of it, but it's about slavery in the city of Detroit. And she went, and many of us other scholars went, to the Roman Catholic Archdiocese, because they've been here since the founding of Detroit by Antoine de la Motte Cadillac. He builds St. Anne's a couple of days after he arrives on the banks of the Detroit River and builds Fort Pontchartrain du Detroit. While he's building Fort Pontchartrain du Detroit, before he's even finished building the fort, he builds St. Anne du Detroit, the first Catholic church in Michigan. So he builds it right there in the fort. And they have the oldest written record of a black person. An unknown negress was buried on the grounds of St. Anne's in 1733. So owned by the Campbells. So we know they got records. So of course, we want to go there. Scholars want to go there for the records. We want to find out what more information do you have about these people who were enslaved in the city of Detroit. You know, you got records going all the way back to the 1700s. And so when we go there, they always say, first, what are you looking for? Well, we might have something, but, you know, we probably don't have much information about that because it's about slavery in the Catholic Church. We don't have any information about slavery because, you know, we weren't into that. Of course, we find everything. So we find out the slave owners, how many people they owned, and not only do we find that out, we find out there are slave owners. The priests are slave owners. The bishops are slave owners. The highest donors to the different Catholic parishes, they're all slave owners. So we find that the Catholic Church in the city of Detroit, and I'm not even talking about the Catholic Church internationally, although that's a whole nother discussion.
That's dangerous, don't do that.
But the Catholic Church in the city of Detroit, starting with St. Anne's, is a slave-owning institution. The church itself, the officials of the church are all slave owners. And so another institution in the city of Detroit that owes is, I can say the Roman Catholic Church, but if I don't want to, you don't want to say that, the Archdiocese or St. Anne's. Either one, you can take your pick. St. Anne's itself, just that one parish, the Archdiocese of the whole Detroit parish, Detroit diocese, or the Roman Catholic Church in general are all party to this. And we can go down the line because the institutions that are created during the period of enslavement, we live with the legacy of them today. So the early people to found what we call the Detroit public schools. Who are these people? Who were these people who founded what we call Detroit public schools? They're these people. So these are these people. So so whatever institution that we still have presently that was existing in the
some role.
had a role or was benefiting from. Okay. So in some cases they were directly involved. In some cases they weren't directly involved, but they benefited from these things. When you call this school, so there's a school that was founded in Detroit in 1817 on Congress and Bates. Okay. And when you call the number, the last 4 digits to this day, the call number is 1817 because it was founded in 1817. It was founded as the Cathalopimistiad, but they changed, that's kind of hard to pronounce, University of Michigania. Then they got rid of the IA and just called it University of Michigan. Oh. The University of Michigan, founded in 1817. What was going on in Detroit in 1817? Well, slavery's going on in the city of Detroit. There's people who are still slave owners in the city of Detroit in 1817. One of them is a major donor and will be on the board of trustees because of his large donations to the school. Joseph Campbell. He's a major donor. Stevens T. Mason will donate land that he has in Ann Arbor so that they move. So they'll move from Detroit in 1837. So they'll be in Detroit for 20 years, and they'll move to Antoine Beaubien.
Are you indicting the Jesuits as well?
So Antoine Beaubien was a slave owner, and he was also a devout Catholic, and he wanted to give this land to the Jesuits, and so that's why that's where it is. So there's 2 streets, Beaubien and Saint Antoine. Right, yeah. Antoine Beaubien. So it's set on that land. So I mean, we can go down the list, but any institution that you can really kind of trace back to the 1800s, particularly the early 1800s or the 1700s for sure, is connected to this history. And so that's in every city. We talking about Detroit, but we could just about pick any city. One problem we have to begin to divorce ourselves from is the 13 colonies. So the idea that that's it, that's America, the 13 colonies. So that's wrong because Michigan wasn't part of the 13 colonies. It was New France, it was part of New France. Well, the French were slave owners too. Right. So let's not just talk about the British in 1619. What were the French doing? Were they slave owners? Yeah, they was. Yeah. What about the Spanish? What was they doing? Yeah, they were slave owners too. What about the Dutch? What was they doing? Yeah, it was slave. So we can go to all these other places that weren't part of the 13 colonies, but were part of other European colonies that were also involved in slavery and talk about it as well. So first problem is the divorcing of the 13 colonies from the Caribbean. So that's another problem. We're taught to think that way because American educational system has taught us to think that way. But when the 13 colonies, there were some other British colonies in the Caribbean. They was all one part of one system. They weren't separated. The only reason they're separated is because the 13 colonies will go to war and win. But at one point, the 13 colonies is the same part of the same system as Barbados, Jamaica, Trinidad, and there's slavery going on in all those places. And slavery going on there before 1619. Right. So 1619 ain't even the beginning. Right. So the oldest part of the United States, the part of the United States that had slavery the longest is not Virginia in 1619. It's Puerto Rico in 1524. Isn't Puerto Rico part of the United States? Well, Puerto Rico had slavery in 1524. They weren't British. They were Spanish slave owners there then. But the Spanish are enslaving black people on sugar plantations in Puerto Rico in 1524. So we a whole 100 years off if we're just talking about the United States. But if we're talking about the Western Hemisphere in general, well, you don't start at 1619. But American educational system wants you to think as small about injustice as possible and as large about American exceptionalism as possible. So when we talk about slavery and what ought to be paid, people try to limit. They don't even want to go to 1619. They want to go to, listen, there wasn't America, 1776 or 1783. They want to start the conversation there. But they don't start the conversation there when they're talking about how great the Pilgrims were. Now they want to talk about the Pilgrims in 1620 or Jamestown in 1607. When it's American exceptionalism, you can go all the way back to Columbus in 1492. But when you're talking about slavery and the injustices that happen, then you want to limit the conversation to, 1865. You know, they want to, so that's the problem. And we have to widen our understanding of what is now America and what is now the legacy of the period of slavery and then the legacy of the other versions of racial inequality that happened after slavery. We have to talk about all of that.
So let me bring it back to the near present. In thinking about what can be done to make us better prepared to receive. Lots of people are like, I'm just one person.
Yes.
What can I do? And I've heard the name, and I don't think anybody should be excused from having to participate. It's really funny how people think that, it's the historian's role,
right.
It's the racial equity, it's the DEI person's
right,
role.
Right.
Like, if you are a participating member in this society, it is also your role.
That's right. If you're a teacher, true.
Yes.
If you were, whatever you are, right.
So, so can we talk about, like, one of the first people I heard about in the Detroit movement was Reparations, Ray Jenkins.
That's right.
And from my understanding, Homeboy was like a real estate agent.
Yes, he was.
So he wasn't like a scholar, a historian, an elected official. He sold real estate.
Mm-hmm.
So can you talk to us about, like, the power of one? Like what was he able to do?
Yes, he placed the idea of reparations on the Detroit consciousness, and using that platform, he put it in enough other people's minds to put it on the national consciousness. We wouldn't be talking about reparations if it wasn't for N'Cobra. And it wouldn't be no N'Cobra without Reparations Ray Jenkins. So let's start there. The idea that we had people after Reparations Ray had really pushed this idea, and we get H.R. 40 from John Conyers, then you're going to get city council people. So in Chicago, you got Dorothy Tillman, and she's putting a reparations ordinance, trying to get a reparations ordinance passed in Chicago. Well, at the very least they want to do is identify the institutions and companies that benefited from slavery. So even before we get to the part about getting money or some kind of compensation, we want to be able to identify who was involved in slavery. And if you want a city contract, you got to divulge your relationship to slavery. In New York, Charles Barron is doing the same thing. So he's I think they call it a borough representative. He's doing that in New York. And in Detroit, we got Councilwoman Joanne Watson trying to do the same thing here in the city of Detroit. And out of this fight, you're going to get attorneys, Willie Gary, Johnny Cochran, and another black woman, Deidre Farmer Perelman, who will institute lawsuits throughout the country to force companies and corporations and universities to divulge their relationship to slavery and their involvement and their benefit from slavery. And that's how I'm able to tell you about insurance companies that were involved in slavery, because their lawsuits will unveil these. In some cases, the lawsuit will unveil it. In other cases, because the companies don't want to get the negative press if it comes out, some other way, they divulge themselves their involvement or their benefit from slavery. And so we get these institutions, these organizations, these businesses that come out. And this is the 80s, the 90s, and the 2000s. So, and of course, Johnny Cochran passed away, but him and Willie Gary, two of the most well-known and top African-American attorneys in the country, this was what they were pursuing in the early 2000s, this fight, this legal fight, by taking it corporation by corporation, state by state, university by university, and then after all of that, creating this move to go for the federal government, to push the federal government, hoping that while they're doing this, H.R. 40 is doing what it's doing. And so that's the point. They were working on all these different areas. They're attorneys, so they're going to do it from the legal aspect.
Right.
But John Conyers is in the House of Representatives, so he's supposed to be working from the congressional, the federal standpoint. And then some of us in our cities, in our towns, in our the institutions we work for, we ought to be doing it on that level. So the fact that Detroit Public Schools was founded in 1842 and black people couldn't go. So black people couldn't go in 1842 when it was founded. And then for decades, when we talked about racial inequality in the schools, we were not talking about Detroit versus Bloomfield, which is what we talk about today, or Detroit versus Grosse Pointe, or Inkster versus Birmingham. That's what we talk about today, a predominantly African-American city with an impoverished school district versus a wealthy, predominantly white school district. In the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, we were talking about a city on one side of the city of Detroit, a school on one side of the city of Detroit versus another school in the same city, with the same school board in charge of both schools, determining how much resources go into the overwhelmingly white school versus how many resources go into the overwhelmingly black school. The schools were unequal in the same district by the same school board. So the school board, Detroit Public Schools, has a price to pay for this decades of inequality that people who were in those positions did. So we're not talking about the school board of today. We're not saying that they're a part of it, but they are in an institution that has a history, and that history has to be accounted for. We're not blaming you because you just got elected yesterday for doing this. We're not blaming you. We're blaming this whole history that has to be accounted for. And if you're in that position today, you should want this history to be accounted. You should want to make an account for this history. You should not want to be a part of an institution that has this still on its belt and it has never got rid of it. It's never dealt with this red ink that they got to deal with. And so that is also a part of it. And we can go through, again, every institution has this history. The Detroit Tigers were owned by the Briggs. And when Walter Briggs owned the Tigers, for number one, they're not going to field no black players. Detroit Tigers is the second to last team in the country to field a black player. Wow. So the Boston Red Sox is the only team that would come after the Detroit Tigers. But more than that, Walter Briggs don't even want them to come into the stadium. He only want black people to be able to see a Tigers game. And for years, that was the policy. Black people couldn't even go see the Tigers. Then, when he does allow them to see the Tigers, he creates a little section in Briggs Field, in Briggs Stadium. He creates a little section where black people could sit, but they can't see almost none of the action on the field. But at least they're there. At least they're in the stadium, but they can't see none of the action on the field. That's Walter Briggs. And that was the Tigers for decades. This was the Tigers. And they still exist. There's a legacy that has to be dealt with. There's a history that has to be addressed. We can't just let that as if that never happened, because it did happen. And it has to be addressed. And so that's part of this history. It has to be accounted for.
So the takeaway for people and organizations who, in the wake of the George Floyd murder, were like, well, what can I do? How can I be an ally? Like, you can start with acknowledging your legacy of,
that's right.
And what your organization benefited from during the period of slavery.
That's right.
So it starts with an acknowledgement and digging into your own legacy, and anybody can do that.
That's right.
So you're saying if you're a part of an institution that in some form was around at that time, there is a connection, and they need to figure out what it is.
That's right.
All right, so I want to leave us on a happy note.
Yes.
My last question, I want you to help us vision. So I've heard you talk a lot about what Detroit might look like had Black Bottom not been decimated for a freeway.
That's right.
So had all those black folks who lost their businesses, lost their homes, lost their political power, lost their connections to community. So had that remained intact, what might we have today? And I ask that question in the context of reparations, because I think if we get some of our repair, we can get to that beautiful black future. So lay it out for us.
So there's a few things we ought to think about. So here in the city of Detroit, in 1943, there was a race riot. So Detroit had a brutal race riot in the city of Detroit, really racial terror, really. And 25 African Americans were killed and 9 whites were killed. Now, I want to be clear. Detroit doesn't have this history of nonviolent civil disobedience for black people. Black people get attacked and they fight back. So in 1943, black people were fighting just like they were being fought. So it was a race. It was white people fighting black people and black people fighting white people. 9 whites got killed by residents. Black folks killed 9 whites. 8 black people got killed by residents. Not by, no authorities, just by regular folk. White folks. 8 black people. 17 black people got killed by members of the Detroit Police Department. No whites got killed by members of the Detroit Police Department. All right, so the police department are rioting too, and they've chosen a side. So it's black people not just fighting white people, citizens, they're fighting the police department too. And so that's why so many more black people are killed and injured, because the police department are involved and they've taken a side. If it was just black people fighting white people, it'd almost been an equal battle, almost. Because black people wasn't really going out to the white neighborhoods, they were staying in Black Bottom. Right. And so whites who came near or in Black Bottom were at a disadvantage because they're in a black community. So that's what happened. So you got the race riot. After the race riot, developers began to approach the mayor about, you need to get rid of Black Bottom. The mayor created a committee to find out the reason for the race riot. And of course, the committee decided that it was black people. It was their fault. The race riot was caused by black people. So he supports a destruction of Black Bottom, partly as a result of this race riot that occurred, which his committee blamed the black community on. The governor had a committee too, and the governor's committee blamed black people too. So the governor created a committee, and they blamed black people. So now you got the governor, you got the mayor, both blaming black people. Now they're going to pass a city plan to destroy Black Bottom. They call it the Gradual Redevelopment Plan, the Elmwood Plan. They got all kind of names for it. They're going to destroy Black Bottom. And the city council votes in favor of it in 1946. In 1949, the federal government gives the cities money to do this. It's called the National Housing Act of 1949. The federal government is going to start tearing down Black Bottom. And in the middle of tearing down Black Bottom, the federal government passes another plan called the Federal Interstate Highway Act, and they're going to build freeways. The cities get to pick where they go. The mayor is now Albert Cobo. He picks Hastings Street. So he's going to destroy Hastings Street. Now you got 350 black-owned businesses. You already got houses and buildings and places in Black Bottom being destroyed. Now you got businesses, entertainment, hotels, restaurants, shops. All that's going to get destroyed. And now we have the development in downtown Detroit, much of which is funded by taxpayers. So we have a arena district, Comerica Park, Ford Field, funded largely by taxpayer funds. We have Little Caesars Arena, largely funded by taxpayer funds. We have a Monroe Street development, block development going on right now down in Detroit, a large part of it coming from taxpayer funds. So you got taxpayers funding billionaire developments, but these black businesses were destroyed by the federal government. They didn't get taxpayer funded. They got destroyed by taxpayer funds. What would happen if they had not been destroyed? So you had 350 black-owned businesses in the 1930s and 40s. What would it look like in 2021 had they not been destroyed? Now let's add on another part. What would it look like if they had gotten federal taxpayer funds like billionaires are getting now? What would it look like now? And then let's add on another thing. If Black Bottom had gotten destroyed, let's say it still got destroyed, but the owners of the land got paid what they ought to get paid for that land, what would they have been able to do? Those are the things we ought to be thinking about when we think about what could be, because we applaud the development that's happening now, but we skip over this history that has already happened.
Mm-hmm. And you've talked also about how we might have black millionaires and billionaires. So there wouldn't be just one singular white savior, Dan Gilbert. There'd be a whole slew of potential black millionaires and billionaires.
Right. Instead of 2 or 3 white billionaires who are doing a lot of the development in Detroit, you'd have 30 or 40 black millionaires and a couple of billionaires who would have benefited from this had something else happen than what really did happen.
Oh, yeah. I think that's a great way for us to end today's discussion, because that's a great vision if we looked at it and how we could potentially get back there. So I definitely want to thank you guys for your time. all the knowledge and the nuggets. I hope we were able to educate and inspire. And for anyone viewing, if you guys are interested in the study group, the information is right behind me on the screen. Feel free to reach out to us. But thank you all for joining us and tuning in. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Yeah.